Hundreds of years ago, medieval cooks didn't rely on supermarkets or fancy imports. They turned to their own backyards for food that didn't just survive, it thrived. Imagine pulling up Good King Henry, a leafy green with iron levels higher than spinach and enough vitamin C to fight off winter scurvy. Back then, plants like this weren't considered weeds. They were the backbone of survival. So what if, somewhere along the way, we traded nutrition for convenience and forgot these garden champions? Today, we're chasing perfect-looking produce with less flavor and fewer nutrients, while the real superfoods have slipped into obscurity. Join me as we dig up the stories of 5 medieval foods that deserve a comeback. And as you watch, let me know in the comments which of these forgotten plants surprises you most. Let's start with a root vegetable that practically grew itself, feeding entire families through the harshest winters. Picture this. You're trudging through a bleak medieval winter, food stores are running low, and the ground is frozen solid. Yet there's a root in your garden that just keeps multiplying, quietly waiting to be pulled up and eaten. That's Skirit, a sweet, resilient root that medieval gardeners counted on when everything else failed. Skirit thrived in poor soil and needed almost no attention. It was the kind of plant you could plant and forget, and it would reward you with a cluster of slender, sugary roots when you needed them most. For families scraping by, that reliability was everything. But Skirit wasn't just survival food. It had a natural sweetness that set it apart from the other root vegetables on the medieval menu. People compared it to parsnips, but with a more pronounced sugary flavor, making it a prized ingredient for anyone lucky enough to grow it. And this wasn't some peasant-only crop. Skirit's reputation for sweetness and ease of growth meant even medieval nobles demanded Skirit in palace gardens. If a root vegetable could make it from a thatched cottage garden to the manicured beds of the elite, you know it had something special going for it. Medieval cooks didn't have the luxury of variety or convenience, so a plant that could do it all was a big deal. Skirit fit the bill. Medieval kitchens roasted, stewed, or mashed these naturally sweet roots, even baking them into pies. Its flavor worked in both savory and sweet dishes, stretching meals and keeping things interesting when options were limited. And unlike many crops that spoiled quickly, Skirit lasted through long, cold winters without turning to mush. If you were trying to keep your family fed until spring, this was the root you wanted in your pantry. Nutritionally, Skirit was a powerhouse for its time. It packed plenty of carbohydrates and natural sugars, exactly the kind of fuel medieval people needed for days filled with hard labor. When you're hauling water, chopping wood, and trying to keep warm in a drafty house, you want food that keeps you moving. Skirit delivered that in spades, making it a staple for both peasants and the upper crust. So how did this sweet, low-maintenance root end up as a historical footnote? The answer is simple. Modern farming changed the game. Once potatoes arrived in Europe, everything shifted. Modern farmers favored faster, larger potatoes that were easier to clean and ship, leaving Skirit behind. Skirit's roots grew in tangled clusters and took more time to harvest and prepare. Potatoes, with their smooth skin and big yields, fit perfectly into the new world of commercial agriculture. Suddenly, Skirit's strengths, its ability to thrive in poor soil, its resilience, its unique sweetness, just didn't matter as much. As farms grew and food started traveling farther from field to table, crops that didn't fit the new model disappeared from the mainstream. Skirit was left behind, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the new definition of efficiency. It survived in a few cottage gardens and old seed catalogs, but for most people, it faded from memory. But here's the thing. Skirit isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone to give it another shot. With today's interest in sustainable agriculture and forgotten foods, Skirit might be ready for a comeback. It's nearly maintenance-free, grows where other crops won't, and offers a natural sweetness that doesn't need any added sugar. For home gardeners and anyone tired of the same old vegetables, Skirit could be the next big thing hiding in plain sight. Despite these advantages, this sweet survivor almost vanished. Next, we'll see a plant that gave medieval cooks every part as food. Meet Alexander's, the plant Romans brought to Britain that medieval cooks treated like a Swiss army knife. This wasn't just another leafy green hiding in the corners of a garden. Alexander's was a workhorse, prized because every single part, stems, leaves, flowers, seeds, could land on the table. In a time when nothing could go to waste, having a plant that pulled double or triple duty was a lifesaver. Alexander's quickly became a staple, not just for its flavor, but because it made survival a little bit easier. Let's break down why medieval cooks kept coming back to Alexander's. The young stems? You ate them like celery, crunchy, fresh, and perfect for tossing into a pottage or stew. The leaves brought a bold, parsley meets celery flavor, giving soups and broths a real punch. Flowers would go into salads, adding a pop of yellow and a subtle taste that broke up the monotony of winter greens. Even the seeds got a job. Ground up as a pepper substitute when the real thing was too expensive to import. If you were running a medieval kitchen, Alexander's was like having a whole spice rack and salad bar growing in your backyard. What made Alexander's even better was how little effort it took to grow. It didn't care if you lived on a windy cliff, beside a muddy roadside, or in the shadow of a monastery wall. It spread like a free volunteer, thriving in places where other crops would give up. Growing up to 6 feet tall, it towered over the rest of the garden, and you didn't have to be a skilled gardener to keep it alive. For medieval families, that meant one less thing to worry about. If you needed food, Alexander's was ready. No fuss, no drama. But Alexander's wasn't just about filling bellies. The leaves and stems packed in vitamins and minerals that were hard to come by, especially in the dead of winter, when you're staring down months of cold, damp weather and your diet is mostly grains and root vegetables. A plant that can keep you from getting sick is worth its weight in gold. Alexander's delivered the nutrients that kept people moving and working, helping to bridge the gap when other crops failed or ran out. You might think a plant this useful would stick around forever, but by the 1700s, celery, with its uniform stalks and milder flavor, took over market gardens, edging out Alexander's chaotic charm. Celery was easier to market, looked neater on the plate, and fit the new mold of what commercial agriculture wanted: predictability and uniformity. Alexander's, with its wild growth and strong taste, just didn't fit the bill. Slowly, it slipped out of gardens and off the dinner table, remembered only by a handful of foragers and old gardening books. Still, it's worth asking, did we lose something important when we let Alexander's fade away? Modern diets are all about variety and nutrition, and here was a plant that offered both, without needing perfect soil or constant attention. Alexander's could handle rough conditions and still provide food and flavor, qualities that seem pretty useful, especially as people look for ways to eat more sustainably. Its peppery, bold taste might be a shock to anyone used to bland supermarket produce, but maybe that's exactly the kind of shake-up our plates need. If you've ever wandered through the remains of an old monastery or seen a patch of tall, leafy green along a coast, you might have walked right past Alexander's. Monks grew it for its reliability, using it to feed whole communities and keep people healthy. It was a plant for tough times and tougher people, offering a steady supply of food when nothing else would grow. So, would you try Alexander's, a wild, peppery green that once fed medieval families, instead of your usual store-bought celery? Let me know in the comments. Some plants faded into history as tastes and farming changed, but others stuck around because they could do it all. Next, let's look at a kitchen essential that pulled triple duty: feeding, healing, and keeping entire families healthy through the hardest months. Step into a medieval garden, and you'd find good King Henry quietly holding everything together. This wasn't some scrawny weed hiding in the shadows. It was the backbone of countless meals, a plant so dependable that families counted on it year after year. Strong in iron, even more than spinach, and rich in vitamin C, crucial against scurvy-like shortages. Good King Henry was a nutritional backup plan in a world where actual backup plans didn't exist. It grew back on its own every spring, barely asking for attention, and kept producing when other crops gave up. If you were scraping by in a drafty cottage, this was the kind of green you wanted outside your door. One plant yielded shoots like asparagus, leaves like spinach, and buds like mini broccoli. In early spring, when most gardens looked like wastelands, Good King Henry's shoots shot up first, giving cooks something fresh to work with weeks before anything else. Those tender shoots got boiled or fried up, a rare treat after months of nothing but dried grains. As the season rolled on, the leaves bulked up and took over as the main green, hearty, filling, and perfect for stretching out a stew or pottage. By summer, the flower buds arrived, and you could toss them into a pot just like broccoli, or eat them raw if you were desperate. Medieval cooks didn't waste a single part. They squeezed every bit of variety they could out of this one plant, turning it into 3 different vegetables depending on the month. Picture a family huddled around a smoky hearth in late winter. The grain bin is running low. The turnips are shriveled. But out in the garden, there's Good King Henry, battered but still alive. They'd snip the leaves and shoots, boil them up, and suddenly a plain, watery soup got a shot of green and a blast of nutrients. This wasn't a luxury, it was survival. When nothing else grew, Good King Henry was the safety net that kept people fed and healthy. Nutritionally, it's almost unfair how much Good King Henry packed into those leaves. Iron was a big deal. People worked hard, got hurt often, and anemia could knock you off your feet. Vitamin C was even rarer, and anyone who's read about medieval diets knows scurvy wasn't just for sailors. This plant filled those gaps, especially during the hungry gap in spring, when everything else was still sleeping. It was the kind of food that made the difference between getting by and getting sick. But Good King Henry wasn't just about what went on the plate. Medieval healers made poultices from its leaves and brewed root teas for digestion, a true all-good plant. If you gashed your hand chopping wood, you'd slap on a leaf poultice and hope for the best. If you spent all winter eating nothing but bread and cheese, a root tea might help get things moving again. This plant earned its reputation as a multitasker by showing up in both the kitchen and the medicine chest. So why did something so useful just disappear? Blame modern farming. When agriculture shifted to big fields and supermarket shelves, plants had to be uniform, easy to harvest, and look good in a crate. Good King Henry, with its wild growth and unpredictable yields, didn't make the cut. Spinach and broccoli took over, neater, easier, and more marketable. In pursuing uniform crops, we lost a wild card, Good King Henry, whose resilience and nutrition modern gardens could still benefit from. Would you grow this reliable green in a small urban garden? Let me know below. It's the kind of plant that laughs at poor soil, shrugs off neglect, and still gives you something to eat when you need it most. Bringing back Good King Henry isn't just about nostalgia. It's about putting real resilience and nutrition back on the menu. Some medieval foods disappeared because they were replaced by something flashier or easier to sell. But others vanished simply because they didn't fit the new rules. And while most vegetables taste exactly like what you'd expect, dirt, grass, maybe a hint of bitterness, there was one oddball that fooled everyone at the table. Medieval kitchens had their fair share of strange ingredients, but nothing turned heads quite like salsify, the so-called oyster of the vegetable world. This root vegetable didn't look like much. Long, wiry, and covered in dark skin that practically dared you to bother with it. Yet, once peeled and cooked, both white and black salsify offered a briny, delicate taste that reminded people of oysters, even when the nearest ocean was 100 miles away. It's no wonder salsify became a staple in the winter months, especially when religious rules took meat and fish off the menu. Salsify's reputation as an oyster substitute wasn't just some kitchen myth. Monastery records from the 1400s show that monks grew salsify specifically to use as a fish replacement during Lent. When you couldn't eat meat or real seafood, salsify became the next best thing. Boiled, fried, or pureed straight into stews to add richness and a hint of something special. Medieval cooks didn't just tolerate salsify, they actually looked forward to it, especially when the winter dragged on and the pantry was down to its last handful of shriveled roots. The real genius of salsify was its timing. When the ground froze and most vegetables disappeared, salsify was still there. Its roots could be dug up all winter, offering a rare taste of freshness when everything else was just dried beans and old bread. You'd head out into the cold, break through the crust of frozen dirt, and pull up these skinny roots. Hardly glamorous, but a lifeline when you needed it most. It was the kind of vegetable that didn't just fill you up, it made the end a little more bearable. Medieval gardens boasted both white and black salsify, each with its fans. White salsify had a softer texture, while black salsify was tougher but just as packed with that signature oyster-like flavor. The preparation was a bit of a hassle. You had to peel away the stubborn skin before cooking, but the payoff was worth it. Records show monks and cooks boiling or frying salsify into purees, tossing it into stews, or even mashing it for a creamy side dish. It wasn't just a backup plan for Lent. It was a culinary highlight in a season when highlights were few and far between. Salsify didn't just earn its place on the table by being available, it was a practical solution to a real problem. How do you keep eating fresh food when nothing grows? The answer was a root that stored well for months, never spoiling or turning to mush. In a world without refrigerators or supermarkets, that kind of staying power was gold. Medieval families relied on salsify to get them through the worst of winter, and cooks found ways to make it taste like a treat instead of a chore. But as the centuries rolled on, salsify's luck ran out. As refrigeration and trade favored smooth, fast-growing roots, salsify's wiry shape and slow growth consigned it to obscurity. Grocery stores wanted carrots and potatoes, vegetables that looked good in a pile and didn't need extra work. Salsify, with its odd appearance and stubborn skin, just couldn't compete, even though it could outlast most vegetables in storage and deliver a flavor you couldn't get anywhere else. It faded into the background, kept alive only by a handful of stubborn gardeners and curious chefs. Still, its unmatched oyster-like taste makes it a treasure for adventurous cooks. Ready for a revival? You might be surprised what other forgotten foods are waiting just outside the mainstream. Speaking of surprises, imagine waiting weeks for your fruit to rot before it is finally ready to eat. Sounds strange, right? Medieval cooks didn't just settle for what was easy or instantly edible. Take the Meddler, a fruit that requires more patience than most people have today. Right off the tree, Meddlers were hard, sour, and basically useless for eating. But in the Middle Ages, they were a prized winter delicacy, because the real magic happened after harvest. By the 1200s, cookbooks featured dozens of Meddler recipes, and these fruits became a familiar part of the medieval kitchen. Here's how it worked. After picking, Meddlers had to go through a process called bledding. This wasn't some fancy culinary trick, just a matter of waiting several weeks until the fruit softened and the skin turned brown and wrinkled. Only then did Meddlers become edible. What started off as a tough, mouth-puckering fruit turned into something sweet, with a texture like cinnamon applesauce. The transformation was so dramatic that it almost felt like a reward for patience. In a world without chocolate bars or soda, Meddlers were a rare taste of sweetness at the darkest time of the year. Bledding wasn't for the impatient. Medieval families would spread Meddlers out on straw or store them in cool rooms, checking on them every few days. You had to watch for just the right moment. Too soon, and the fruit was still sharp. Too late, and it might spoil. But if you got it right, you'd end up with a soft, brown fruit that tasted nothing like what you started with. It was a waiting game, and everyone in the house knew when the Meddlers were finally ready. When it came time to eat, medieval cooks didn't just stop at biting into a bledded Meddler. These fruits were baked into tarts, gelled into spreads, or fermented into wine and cordials. Cookbooks from the 13th century show just how many ways people found to use them. A Meddler tart might show up at a holiday feast, while Meddler jelly could stretch the last bit of sweetness through the winter. Even nobles got in on the action, serving Meddler wine at fancy banquets. For a fruit that started out as almost inedible, Meddlers managed to become a symbol of both resourcefulness and celebration. But Meddlers weren't just about flavor. Timing was everything. They ripened late in the year, sometimes not until November, right as everything else in the garden was dying off. That made them one of the last fresh fruits available before winter really set in. After bledding, Meddlers could sit on the shelf for several more weeks, giving families a rare treat when supplies were running low and the days felt endless. In a medieval cottage with little to look forward to except cold weather and root vegetables, a Meddler was a genuine morale boost. Of course, all this waiting and fussing over a wrinkled fruit doesn't sound very appealing to modern shoppers, as consumers demanded perfect-looking fruit ready to eat. Wrinkled Meddlers lost out to apples and pears. Modern agriculture wanted fruits that looked good, shipped well, and could go from farm to table in days, not weeks. Meddlers, with their odd appearance and need for patience, didn't stand a chance. They faded from markets and gardens, remembered only by a few stubborn gardeners and the occasional historian. But here's something to think about. Maybe we lost more than just a fruit. Meddlers represent a way of eating that's almost disappeared, one that values patience, tradition, and a deeper connection to the seasons. They're tough, they grow in poor soil, and they offer a kind of sweetness you can't find in the produce aisle. For anyone willing to wait, Meddlers still have a place in the garden and on the table. Imagine baking a Meddler tart with fruit you've watched ripen for weeks, or spreading Meddler jelly on fresh bread when the snow is falling outside. That's a taste of history you can actually experience. Could you handle waiting for weeks to enjoy fruit? Share your patience level in the comments. Meddlers might seem like a relic, but they remind us how much our relationship with food has changed. Sometimes what we've lost in the name of convenience is worth a second look. The story of these lost medieval foods is a reminder that what's easy isn't always what's best. Skirit, Good King Henry, and the others weren't just garden oddities. They were survival tools, packed with nutrients and tough enough to handle rough conditions. Modern farming chose looks and speed over flavor and resilience, and somewhere along the way, we let these superfoods slip through the cracks. Which of these would you try or even grow, and why? Drop your choice below. If you're fascinated by these lost crops and want more medieval food secrets, like, subscribe, and ring the bell for updates. Rediscovering these plants might just change how you think about food. Old wisdom feeding modern diets.